District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Happy President's Day weekend from Northern Virginia. I hope this podcast finds you well. The snow is thawing. There's a lot of exciting things ahead. I'm going to Safari Club International Trade Show to cover the show. It's my third time covering. I skipped last year. Happy to be revisiting and look forward to seeing many of you, hopefully, in Nashville. As it relates to this episode, why I'm releasing this later, I was waiting for updates on the Potomac River sewage issue. And now there's a response from the president. But today I'm going to focus on the endangerment finding repeal briefly and also the aftermath of the January 19th following the collapse and the breaking of the Potomac Interceptor, which has reportedly dumped, I've seen estimates between 200 million to 300 million to as high as 1 billion gallons of sewage into our waterways. The Potomac seeps into little creeks and rivers. The Chesapeake is the ultimate place where it flows. It's a big crisis. I'm so glad, and I'm not someone who really is privy on federal intervention, but because of just the mismanagement of local governments, this is where it's appropriate for the federal government to steep in because of the crossing of different jurisdictions. We'll talk about that. But let's first start with the endangerment finding. A lot of environmentalists are upset about this being repealed, and they're not focusing conveniently on the brewing controversy and potential crisis that the Potomac River is facing. I've discussed the endangerment finding, the 2009 endangerment finding before, but I think I should give a recap. I was also mentioned in the White House press release in praise of this move, and some of you might have questions like, why did I sign on to it? Why was my statement relayed there? I'm grateful to my comms team at Independent Women for doing that. But I have long supported this repeal, and it's not because I want dirty air, dirty water, dirty lands. I'm a practical person, and I think those of you who followed the show for many years since we started in 2018, or if maybe you've tuned in recently, you know that I have consistent application of my principles. I'm not swinging one way or another. For convenience sake, I actually research and base my opinions off of different factors and due diligence. And when I started to get involved in energy policy several years ago, and even beyond that early in my career in media, I've always had an interest to investigate underreported or misunderstood things. I was always intrigued by why climate activists are so beholden to this rule. Why does this regulation guarantee that the climate is going to be better, that environmental quality is going to be superb? Why do we have to rely on so many regulations to do that? And as someone who is very skeptical of overregulation, I believe in reasonable regulation, limited government. I'm a conservative. That's where I fall. I'm honest about that. I'm not hiding who I am. And I believe this tagline, which I'm surprised no one has run with and trademarked, deregulation won't lead to the decimation of the environment, or deregulation won't lead to degradation of the environment. It's a little alliteration, if you remember in English class, that kind of rhetorical style and device. Kind of difficult to roll on the tongue, but you say it fast enough, it works. But I usually use that tagline whenever I give public speeches, give interviews, and talk about why you don't have to have so many regulations and you can still maintain environmental quality. And so here's to recap the rule. So 2007, the Supreme Court, which was a very different Supreme Court, it was more liberal, I wouldn't call it liberal, more progressive-leaning court, because we need to retake classical liberal back, in my personal opinion. The Supreme Court said that greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide can be regulated as a pollutant, and the EPA has that right to do so. The Obama administration, when it came in the start of 2009, I believe it was summertime or fall time when this rule change by the EPA happened, they used this Supreme Court ruling as the basis of that regulation at the agency level, so the Environmental Protection Agency. They used this and they justified the creation of this regulation, which went unchallenged for many, many years, 15 years, because the Trump administration initiated the process of deregulation or repeal last summer. So for 15 years, this has been untouchable. Although in Trump 1.0, I believe they had discussions but didn't want to pursue it. Now they did under Lee Zeldin. But originally, it was used as a way to regulate gas-powered cars. And it had application, like other climate policies, onto power plants. industries, and others that were deemed too carbon intensive. So you kind of get the connection in where this is going. So to me, I saw this as a detriment to not only economic productivity, because yes, I'm a free market believer. I believe that as society advances and progresses, you will see, naturally speaking, a cleaner environment. When people have more disposable income, they can care about their environmental surroundings. When people are constantly in fear that they can't afford utility bills, they can't afford basic living standards, they don't care about the environment. Poll after poll shows this. And I'm going to get back to the endangerment finding, but permit me to give this anecdote if you will. So with the endangerment finding, and let's say climate policies by extension and broadly speaking, when people, especially Americans, are pressed, do you want to pay X amount of dollars additional a month to fight climate change or fight a so-called climate crisis? Do you know what that support level is? It used to be 5 years ago that 50 some odd % of Americans would pay $1 additional per month to fight climate change. What was it last year? This was AP NORC, and I'll put this in the show notes if you're curious where I drew the statistic from. Across the last 5 years, that support, even for increasing your bill by $1 to fight climate change, or so you think you're going to fight it, it went down to 38%. Talk about a precipitous decline. So people in America are seeing that there's not a positive correlation between more regulations and a decrease in carbon emissions. And if you look at the government charts, when America peaked with carbon emissions in 2005, you've seen a downward trajectory of emissions since then in the past 20 some odd years. And do you know what that's actually attributed to? It's not overregulation. It's not the endangerment finding. It's not the Inflation Reduction Act. It's none of that. Actually, it's because of the shale boom, fracking, hydraulic fracturing, that we saw a steep decline in emissions, energy innovation, including that too, but largely because of the natural gas revolution. I will find that chart and, again, link to the show notes if you're curious. So to me, as I've become more well-versed in these issues, I've educated myself. I look at data, I look at charts, I look at empiric evidence. I try to look at scientists who are not vested in politics first. They actually believe in climatology or climate science, are well-informed in their views, and they're not having an agenda. When you look at this rule, critics of the repeal of the endangerment findings say this is so unscientific. This is terrible. How dare you do this, Trump administration? And this is a visceral negative reaction you always see from climate activists when policies they like and endorse and rely on get repealed. But this was actually an administrative action. And I'm going to paraphrase Ryan Maui, who was a former NOAA scientist. And he's a meteorologist. He's a climatologist, very serious guy, relies on data, empirical evidence, facts first. And he tweeted to the effect that this is an administrative rule and not a scientific finding. There was an accompanying report teeing up the announcement or teeing up the perhaps decision to reconsider and inevitably repeal the 2009 endangerment finding that was by 5 scientists commissioned by the Department of Energy, explaining that there is no consensus, or rather you can challenge the consensus. The so-called 97% of scientists agree with this consensus that we're in a crisis, due to carbon dioxide. There is a little bit of a sticking point, and in the announcement, they didn't mention the report, and there is some kind of back and forth over whether that report will stand, but it was an excellent report. Some friends of mine were advising on that, and it really put into challenge that basing rules off of the endangerment finding, which Congress did not change, whether or not under the Clean Air Act, Section 202 of the Clean Air Act, can Congress regulate carbon dioxide, which is only 0.04% of the atmosphere, as a pollutant. And that was not even changed by Congress. So like Ryan mentioned, and you can find in show notes, it was an administrative change. It wasn't congressional. It wasn't denoted and updated under the Clean Air Act, Section 202. You look at the existing list of criteria pollutants under the CAA, you don't find carbon dioxide. You find carbon monoxide, you find lead, you find sulfate dioxide, and 3 other pollutants, but no mention of CO2. Legally speaking, I'm not a lawyer, but what I can understand and extrapolate from how we got here, the reason why the Trump administration was able to do this. After 2007, 2009, the Supreme Court ruled in 2 very landmark cases that the EPA's authority to regulate in such a manner, especially greenhouse gases, is limited. Only Congress has that authority because it's the rulemaking body. The West Virginia versus EPA case in 2022 related to the Obama PowerPoint plan, or Power Plant 1.0 plan, to regulate and prematurely shut down coal, natural gas, and even nuclear power plants. under the guise of fighting climate change. The Biden administration proposed a rule to take that even further, and thankfully that was never finalized, and I believe it was legally challenged after the 22 ruling that came out. And they said that you can't regulate greenhouse gases of power plants in this fashion. Only Congress can change the definition. So it kind of teed this up. And even more broadly speaking, as it relates to the bureaucracy and federal agencies, you had Loper Bright, this very critical decision from commercial fishermen, which had application to the EPA and other agencies that they can't develop or they can't decide on ambiguous rules. And anything that's ambiguous still has to go back to Congress. So there were, in the case of Loper Bright with these commercial fishermen in Maine, in the Northeast, they had monitors and they had to fork over a huge portion of their salaries to pay for monitors to observe them. Again, an ambiguous rule for the Commerce Department. Loper Bright, the Supreme Court justices said that's illegal. You can't do that. And only Congress has the ability to rule make. That's essentially what it is in layman's term. If you're not a lawyer, that's what you can take away from that. So these two court cases basically teed up the repeal of the endangerment finding, and thank goodness for that. Following the announcement of the repeal, of course you saw a reaction that was negative, apoplectic, doomsday, alarmist, what have you. The usual suspects who oppose anything, any semblance of deregulation. They're going to scream and be angry. And you saw this reflected on Twitter. However, maybe you glossed over a report from Axios. Axios, interestingly enough, said even if you don't have the endangerment finding, emissions will continue to decrease. What a novel concept because of energy innovation. How else can emissions also decrease? By shoring up more nuclear, in addition to new natural gas, geothermal, and other reliable sources. Even the oft-vilified coal and petroleum, those are produced today in a much cleaner fashion than they were 50 years ago. So they would be emitting far less in carbon emissions. But natural gas and nuclear and geothermal would even do a job in reducing that even more if you're concerned about carbon emissions. That is where we are with the endangerment finding. You are going to see some legal challenges from these interest groups. Groups, believe it or not, and unsurprisingly, that are silent, like I said, on the Potomac sewage problem, which we're going to get into shortly. And then also the groups that oppose nuclear. Natural Resources Defense Council, upset about the endangerment finding repeal, does not support nuclear. Unsurprising and shocking. I'm being sarcastic. Sierra Club, another preservationist alarmist group. Where do they fall on nuclear? They also oppose it as well. I take what they say with a grain of salt, not because I'm a conservative or because I like this move from the Trump administration, or not because I'm trying to be contrarian, but they just are so hypocritical with being outraged over this and not actual problematic crises afoot. Which leads me to the Potomac River sewage spill that we have been facing here in the Beltway. Ahead of Winter Storm Firm, a pipe that is called the Potomac Interceptor burst. It transports what I was reading sewage from McLean, Virginia to Montgomery County, basically Virginia sewage to this pipe to then store and then transfer elsewhere. So this pipe breaks. Built in the 1960s, I believe it was completed in 1960, the Potomac Interceptor carries 60 million gallons of wastewater daily from Dulles Airport to Potomac Pumping Station in Washington, D.C. And I'm reading from D.C. Water, which oversees this infrastructure project. Flows from the pump station, are then sent to Blue Plains Advanced Wastewater Treatment Facility before discharge into the Potomac River. The PI was built as a result of Public Law 86-515, the Act, by the 86th Congress on June 12, 1960. The Act authorized the District of Columbia to plan, construct, operate, and maintain a sanitary sewer to connect Dulles to the D.C. sewer system. I was mistaken. It was Dulles, not McLean. And you go a little further, it's Dulles. But you understand kind of the context. So the PI serves Fairfax, Loudoun County. I live in Fairfax County. Town of Vienna, Herndon, Dulles Airport, and Montgomery County, Maryland. DC Water is performing replacement and rehabilitation of the PI. So the pipe bursts. While we were enduring this storm, DC area basically froze over, so people were not aware of the situation. I've been talking to people locally now, and they were just learning about this because most of the local governments, the governors of Virginia and Maryland, have been virtually silent. I have not heard any talk of this from my senators, from the senators in Maryland. I've not heard any mention of this by local politicians, with the exception of those who are more further away from this. It's been virtual silence from so-called environmentalists who lead governments in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. One of the first entities to draw awareness to this was the Potomac River keepers. And much of the media, except for a handful, and I'm going to praise the media folks that have actually been on top of this, virtual silence except for the locals. National news is just starting to pick this up. Thank goodness Fox talked about this. I've heard mention on this on Fox News Channel, but an early proponent of this story is Katie Pavlich, host of the new News Nation show, primetime show, Katie Pavlich Tonight. I've known Katie. You all are familiar with Katie. She's appeared on the program several times, and she has been on top of this story because no one else is talking about it. So kudos to Katie and her team at News Nation for drawing awareness to this. Fox News is picking up on this. I heard even local sports radio hosts who never get political or never talk about things drawing attention to this. You had local DC area blogs talking about the issue of the sewage and calling this disaster the Potomac and yada, yada, yada. But again, virtual silence from these so-called pro-environmentalist governors and leaders who have governed the Beltway. I'm talking about DC, politically speaking, has been governed by one-party rule for many, many decades. And Maryland and Virginia no longer has Youngkin. If Governor Youngkin were still in charge, I think he would have a very prompt response to this. But his successor has said nothing as of this recording. Governor Wes Moore of Maryland, who is trying to run for president, nothing from him either. So environmentalists go very quiet, so to speak, when it's not the usual scapegoat. So I noticed that they're selective as to who they target. We've seen this. It's a recurring theme. I've talked about this for many years on the show, that unless the scapegoat is not politically advantageous, they don't care. So when the 2015 Gold King mine spill in Colorado happened, that was under President Obama's watch. There were 3 million gallons of water was polluted, and it took forever to clean that up until the Trump administration, under the first EPA administrator he had, Scott Pruitt, they cleaned it up, and they earned rare praise from environmental groups and media for doing such. Before I talk about the president's actions that were announced later today that he's going to be overtaking, likely with the Army Corps of Engineers, EPA jurisdiction over this, because it is crossing so many different areas where the federal government does have to intervene, unfortunately. Let me point you to a study that'll get you to think and challenge this notion that overregulation is going to always guarantee a clean environment. That's not always the case. Sean Reagan, who is a Manhattan Institute fellow, he used to be with the Property and Environment Research Center, and he was formerly a national park ranger too. We're going to have him on the program. He pointed me to this very interesting study that was released in 2015, which is entitled Government Agencies Less Likely Than Private Firms to Comply with Environmental Regulations. Talk about an inconvenient truth. Let me read a little bit more of the synopsis of this. Government entities are less likely to comply with certain federal environmental regulations than are similar entities owned by private companies, according to a new study co-authored by an Indiana University researcher. And regulatory authorities are less vigorous in enforcing the rules when they are regulating other governments, the study finds. Publicly owned facilities are less likely to face fines or other sanctions for violations than those owned and run by private firms. Quote, we find pretty good evidence for power plants, hospitals, and water utilities that government-owned facilities are more likely to violate standards than are their private sector counterparts, said David Konitsky, of the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University Bloomington, a co-author of the study. And when they do violate, the government is less likely to come down hard on them, end quote. The Pew Research Center released a poll last year asking Americans what do they think of the Trump administration's performance so far on environmental issues. And believe it or not, there was a very interesting statistic that I constantly reference. 54% of Americans believe you can slightly deregulate while maintaining clean air, clean water, and land standards, because they see that this need to constantly regulate, to fine, to micromanage, to spend billions, trillions of dollars to fight a so-called climate crisis, going back to the endangerment finding, to have the means to an end to decarbonize your economy by 2050, or some other impractical goal which is not economically sustainable, and you won't see one iota of benefit for the environment. So we're spending all this untold of money, which is why government can invite more problems to environmental crises, which is what you see today happening in our region. I was earlier today at Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate. I try to go every year for free open house day for President's Day. If you have not done that, I highly recommend it. And I went towards the Potomac section. I didn't see anything funky or out of the ordinary yet. I don't know if it's flowed downstream to my section of Virginia. I live close by the Potomac. And I'm very concerned as someone who lives here in the state, in the Commonwealth, and close to the river. If this issue is not addressed, it could affect, and it will affect, not only biodiversity, water quality, issues with wildlife, fish will probably be decimated. And think of the long-term effects. We always keep hearing mixed results and mixed kind of findings of blue crab studies, shad are always imperiled, the shad are not doing so well. There's been limitations on striper bass fishing. This will have downstream negative effects if this is not properly addressed and in a timely fashion. So much of the ecosystem that thrives off of the Potomac and bleeds into flows into the Potomac, because these are very interconnected waterways, if you're unfamiliar. And also it'll make recreation impossible to do. So you were thinking about boating or kayaking or doing some sort of water sports in the Potomac this year, you have to reconsider. This is going to take at least 9 months to clean up. That's what a lot of the reporting is saying. We don't have 9 months for something. If what we're told in terms of the E. coli levels and the bacteria that have been flowing into the Potomac as a result of January 19th, this pipe burst, we have a big problem on our hands. And Katie Pavlich talked about this on her program, that this is manifold times more concerning in terms of the spillage than the Exxon Valdez spill that happened. So where is the outrage from environmentalists? Again, it goes back to the fact that they think government can't do no wrong and that only private actors are the worst despoilers of the environment. But as I cited the Gold King mine spill, there have been other instances where government will perpetuate a crisis or invite more. I think with a lot of these solar and wind projects, when they stop working, those that have been subsidized that might be falling on public lands all over the West, those that were greenlit by the Biden admin are still continuing. Let's say those become decommissioned. I worry in terms of end of life and recycling. What type of crisis could we have if you cannot properly recycle the blades, which we see graveyards pile up in Texas and elsewhere across the country? Also, you're talking about these solar panels, which have lots of toxic elements contained in them, and they're just left there. I think of the Ivanhoe solar plant that was built in the Obama administration, stopped working, went out of commission, and now it's just sitting there, and it could potentially be a Superfund site. Which goes back to, again, the problem that you can't put your faith in government to fix an environmental problem. However, when you have an administration that says that you don't have to trade one goal for another, you can balance economic prosperity with environmental protection or conservation efforts. The Trump administration has exceedingly succeeded here in this area. I mean, not only because of the Endangerment finding repeal, but also because that it's just a strong position. People are seeing gas prices go down. Electricity is going to be a little tricky because that's more with the states. But you see energy inflation going down because we did see natural gas, oil production, all of that was actively and deliberately suppressed. Let's not kid ourselves. Nuclear, even though the Biden administration somewhat supported it, they were so over-reliant on solar and wind, batteries, all these full electrification efforts. So we even were behind on nuclear. So this is where the Trump administration is going to be coming in. And I think this is appropriate to have them here because it crosses so many jurisdictions. It's also the federal government has some overlap here. DC is the seat of government in the United States. The same approach was taken recently with the East Palestine spill and then also with the Tijuana sewage problem. EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin has actually done a great job of fixing that issue and ensuring that that is not going to be spilling into San Diego, where I went to college. So Republican administrations, you may dislike them, you may not agree with them, you may think they're terrible to the environment, but when you read beyond the lines and you go surface deep and you dig a little bit more, you actually see that the EPA under Republicans, it was started by Nixon, Republican, not a perfect entity. They have sometimes crossed into dangerous territory and have been abused, and some people have abused their positions in the EPA. But I have seen under Zeldin so far and what I saw under Trump 1.0, they actually did seriously care about cleaning up Superfund sites, addressing problems before they metastasize and become a real concerning issue. And that's why they're stepping in here. So East Palestine, horrible spill, happened at the tail end of the Biden administration. Trump administration came in. Almost you don't hear anything bad about it. There's still some looming negative effects, some concerns because of the toxic chemicals that spilled there, but they're trying to rectify that. The Tijuana spill I'm mentioning, that was a long-standing issue. I had no idea. I lived in San Diego for 3 years. I had no idea that there was an issue of Mexico dumping in sewage and wastewater into the Bay of San Diego and trickling it into the beaches. That's horrible. And thankfully, they are working to fix that issue as well. Now we have a third situation because of this unforeseen event in Washington, D.C. with the Potomac Interceptor bursting. I will read a little bit of a excerpt from the president's statement. So he's calling it, this is a massive ecological disaster unfolding in the Potomac as a result of gross management of local Democrat leaders, particularly Governor Wes Moore of Maryland. A sewer line breach in Maryland has caused millions of gallons of raw sewage to be dumped directly into the Potomac River, a result of incompetent local and state management of essential waste management systems. This is the same governor who cannot rebuild a bridge. He's not wrong there. It is clear local authorities cannot adequately handle this calamity. Therefore, I'm directing federal authorities, and this is me inserting, I think it's going to be possibly FEMA, the Army Corps of Engineers, EPA for sure, and all supporting agencies to immediately provide all necessary management direction and coordination to protect the Potomac, the water supply in the capital region, and our treasured natural resources in our nation's capital city. While state and local authorities have failed to request needed emergency help, I cannot allow incompetent local, quote, leadership to turn the river in the heart of Washington into a disaster zone. As we saw in the Palisades, the Democrat war on merit has real consequences. The federal FEMA, which is currently being defunded by Democrats, will play a key role in coordinating the response. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. So regardless of your feelings of the Trump administration, you don't have to like them. But if they respond to this in a timely fashion, and they're going to get and extract cooperation with the local governments, I kid you not, they will probably have some photo op. They will all meet. They will put aside their differences. This usually happens, even with Trump's bluster. You will see Trump, the local DC officials, and the governors of Maryland and Virginia get together and find a way to solve this, because now it's a national attention with the Trump administration weighing in directly. When the president weighs in directly, he's a good media marketer. He knows how to garner attention. So for something like this that requires and needs national attention, this is a very good step. I think this is something he should be applauded for. Absolutely. So where are the groups that are very upset about the endangerment finding being repealed in the Potomac River crisis? That's a question I'm going to keep asking until I get answers. I don't think I'm going to get answers, and I'm not the only person asking these questions. Kudos to the Trump administration for weighing in here. I also forgot to mention WMAL, O'Connor and Company, Larry and his co-hosts have been talking about this as well, so they deserve a shout out as well. Local news has really been on the forefront of this story. Again, sportscasters were talking about this, but ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, nowhere to be found, but now they may have to be forced to cover the issue because the president has weighed in, and they love weighing in. It's like catnip, so now they have to respond in this manner. I will try to keep tabs of the situation because this really does hit literally close to home for so many of us who call this region home. I like to fish in the Potomac. I don't eat from the Potomac because it's not the best quality of fish. You can catch fish and eat it downstream towards Fredericksburg. I don't recommend eating. And sadly, the people who are advocating for swimming in the Potomac by 2030, that goal is not going to happen. And you have to be a little delusional to think that you could swim in the Potomac. It's not the cleanest waterway. Now it's not going to be hospitable for swimming and even boating conditions. So it's a tragic situation. Let me tell you, as someone here firsthand, I will continue to monitor the situation, but I am very pleased to see the Trump administration act and more in media drawing awareness to this. But where are the environmentalists? Where are you? You claim to care about natural surroundings, and because it's not your usual scapegoat, nowhere to be found. I'm just asking questions, as some people would say. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.